So we are on the home stretch of the book of Colossians tonight, and those of you who are joining us for the first time in a little while, you're just in time for the tail end, the last few verses. I don't know if you've ever taken one of these read through the Bible in a year program. I've done it several times. I did it the first time in my last couple of years of elementary school, and I try and do it in a different translation each year so I get used to the text. And there's this challenge that you get to when you try and read through the whole Bible in a year. If you do about 3 chapters a day from January 1st to the end of December, you get through the whole Bible. But we always reach this challenging point, and it arrives when you hit the first 9 chapters of 1st Chronicles. It's 9 chapters of genealogies. And so-and-so begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, and his son's name was so-and-so, and his son's name was so-and-so, and he fathered so-and-so. And there are 9 chapters of genealogies. Now, that's bad enough, but it's all Hebrew names that are hard to pronounce. If it was John and Tom and Harry and Bob, but it's Ashpenaz and Hezekiah and Mephibosheth, and you get tongue twisters. And to make it even worse, it's all repetition. They're all genealogies that you've already read before in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and the books of Kings. So it's really this test to see if you're going to make it through. And then, as if that wasn't hard enough, if you start in Genesis 1 in January, you hit the 9 chapters of genealogies in 1 Chronicles at the end of February. It's dark outside, you're about to give up, you're really frustrated, you're trying to hang in there, and all of a sudden there's 9 chapters of genealogies, and you go, Lord, have mercy, I'm trying to be good, help me out a little here. I have a friend who knows these strange dates in the year. He knows the date in the year, on average, when most people give up on their new annual gym membership. You know, you sign up for the gym on January 1st, and apparently the average drop date is somewhere between January 8th and January 12th. It doesn't say much about us, I guess, huh? And then if you make it through 1 Chronicles and all the 9 chapters of genealogy, I confess there are other moments where there's portions where you're tempted to skim a little. You know, you're just sort of skimming. And there are 2 of Paul's epistles that do something strange. There are 2 of Paul's epistles that end the last half chapter just a list of names. And if we're honest, when you read through Colossians, when you read through Romans, you get to the last chapter full of names, you're kind of skimming to get to the end, right? Because you've read the important stuff. You've read the first 3.5 chapters where Paul tells you to be good and how to behave and how to share your faith. And you read through Romans and it's all about our redemption and we're saved by grace through faith. And you've read all the important stuff, and then you hit the last 20 verses with all this weird list of names, and we want to skim. But I got to tell you, they're there for a reason. I would suggest actually that they're there for at least 3 good reasons. We started this morning our journey through the Gospel of Luke. And one of the things that we've noted in Luke, and we'll see this happening regularly, Luke helps us to place the events of the gospel, the incarnation of Jesus, at a precise point in history. And he does it by linking it to names and actual events and places and dates in history. He talks about a census that was ordered by Augustus. He talks about King Herod, and he talks about the date when King Herod's temple was completed. And he gives you these dates and times in these places. And when somebody's conscripted to help Jesus carry the cross, it isn't just a bystander. It's Simon of Cyrene. And he fills in, he gives you the names in the places. And this counteracts the thinking that the epistles are these unreliable texts written by somebody else pretending to be Paul and Peter and John. Now, those who take a liberal reading of the epistles say, well, you know, the epistles, you know, they're written 2 centuries later by somebody who was pretending he was Paul and you're sort of writing under Paul's name. And okay, I could almost excuse that, you know. I could almost excuse somebody sort of doing that 100 years later. They wanted to do a little bit of teaching, and they were teaching in the same vein that Paul would have taught, or they were carrying on with some of the teaching about love that John would have taught, and so they write a little epistle about love, and they say, well, you know, it's almost like if John wrote. But to do this, to do a whole half chapter of salutations, of giving people's name and say hello to Phoebe and to John and to James, and that's like outright deceit, right? So you can't really have it both ways. Either the epistles are trustworthy, either this is actually somebody writing saying hello and goodbye to friends, or it's somebody making it up. And so the fact that these names are there, they help us realize that these epistles, these are letters. These are letters written by somebody. These are letters written by somebody in one city to a church in another city at a point in time. So that's the first valuable lesson. The names are there. These little verses full of details and names at the beginning and the end of the epistles are there to anchor them in history as historical document. And secondly, when you compare the epistles to the letters we write today, one of the things you might notice is that there's no date. And when you write a friend a letter, at the top right-hand corner, you write Sunday, November 14th, 2021, and your email does it for you automatically, right? You don't have to think about it. You send an email, it automatically pops in the date and the time. That wasn't part of the custom on letters when they were written in their day. My grandmother used to tell me of a time when there was 2 mail deliveries every day. Can you believe this? They used to deliver the mail twice a day, morning and afternoon or morning and evening. And so when you wrote a letter to somebody, you would not only write the date you're writing, you'd write AM or PM. And sometimes you'd write a letter to somebody in the morning, they'd get it, and they'd get it at night, and they'd send you a response, and you had your response back the next morning. But the Romans did mail okay. They were the first ones to do mail delivery, but it wasn't that fast. It wasn't fast enough that you needed to write the time and whether it was AM or PM. And so Paul, like the other people who wrote letters at his day, he wrote these letters, but he didn't tell you when he wrote it, in 52 or 53 or 57 or 61 or 62 AD. And so we kind of have to guess when the letters were written. And one of the things that helps us to do that is we look at the salutations, and by looking at the salutations, we can get an idea of when the epistles were written. You might not realize this, but the epistles in the New Testament are not arranged in alphabetical order, in chronological order. They're not in the order that they were written. In case you've ever wondered how the New Testament was put together, there's the 4 Gospels, there's the Acts of the Apostles, and then they took the big batch of letters that we've got, the letters by Paul, right? And you know how to decide what order to put them in? They started with the longest one, and they went with the shortest. There was not even a guess about the chronology. Romans is the longest, and then 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and then Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, you get shorter and shorter. That's how they picked them. And then they picked the next biggest batch of letters, and there was Hebrews and James, and then they go down there and they get shorter and shorter again. They didn't know the chronology. And so having these words, these names, and these salutations, it helps us figure out, okay, so 1 Corinthians was written when he was there, and he wrote Philippians from jail. That was a second imprisonment because he's saying hello to this guy. So these names that are there, they help us to place the epistles one next to the other. Now, one of the striking things is that often in his letters, Paul says hello to people he's never met. The 2 epistles that have the longest list of salutations at the end are Romans and Colossians. Paul never met the church in Rome, and he never met the church in Colossae. And this sounds pretty strange. You're writing this letter to people you've never met, and you have all of this stuff to say to them. This underlines how well the gospel had already progressed. By the time Paul is writing the last of his letters, by the time he's writing Romans, by the time he's writing Colossians, the news of the gospel of Jesus Christ had spread to all of these other cities. So there were people that Paul had led to faith who traveled to another city, who'd led other people to faith, who traveled to another city, who'd led other people to faith, who traveled to another city, who shared their faith, who'd led other people to faith. So that when Paul is writing to Romans, in Romans, there are people who'd been led to faith by people Paul had led to faith, by people who Paul... There was this cycle. And so these epistles with these salutations, they affirm to us that the gospel was spreading. It was spreading from city to city. It was spreading by word of mouth, and one from friend to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And so it underlines how fast and how far the gospel was spreading. And the fourth important thing about the salutations we find in the epistles is that it tells us a lot about Paul's pastoral heart. Sometimes in his writing, Paul says some pretty hard stuff. In his teaching, there's moments where he says, fly straight and behave. Smarten up. You're messing up your Christian life. Don't you know a Christian shouldn't act this way? And if you read just those portions of the epistles, you get this feeling like Paul is this, authoritarian, dictatorial guy. He stands in the pulpit and just tells you what to do. And then you get to the greetings at the end, and Paul talks to you about his friend who's sick. And he asks for prayer for the other people who are out of food. And he talks about this other guy that he loves like his own life. Many of us at best as pastors, and I confess that I struggle with this, it's a struggle just to care for the people here in the building. Sunday by Sunday, the people who come, and I do my best, and I keep my little prayer notebook, and I try and keep tabs on it, and I pray for people, and I send emails, and I try and visit people, and I try and make those connections. But I got to tell you, I don't do justice to even the people in the building who come to see me. And here's Paul. He's got such a pastor's heart. He's not only caring for the people who are in his little circle, who are with him in his little city. Paul's concerned about people who are thousands of kilometers away that he's never met in a little city where they're brought to faith by somebody who are brought to faith by somebody else that he brought. And Paul is concerned about them. And you just see his pastoral heart coming through and praying and pleading for people that he's never met. So that's the intro. So don't skip over the salutations and the greetings. They're important. There's a reason why they're there. Let's take a look at our text. We're at the end of Colossians 4. And we're going to start at verse 7 or 8. And the section falls into 4 or 5 natural sections, starting at verse 7. First, Paul's going to have to take care of some housekeeping. He's sending this letter. It's a manuscript. It's a scroll. He's going to send it with somebody. Somebody's going to carry the letter for him. He's not going to put it in, the Queen's Royal Mail or Canada Post. He's going to send it by somebody who's going to carry this letter. We actually think they're carrying several letters for him. There's this letter that we're reading, the letter to the Colossians. And in the next paragraph, Paul is going to mention the letter to the Laodiceans. Laodicea was the area where Ephesus was, and we think that's the letter to the Ephesians. So we think that Paul sends Colossians and Ephesians, the 2 letters at the same time, by these guys who are going to carry it with them. And it's going to be important that when the churches in Colossae and Ephesus receive these letters, that they take them seriously, that they know they're from Paul. So Paul wants to establish the credibility of the 2 men that he's sending to carry that letter for him. So starting in verse 7 of Colossians 4, starting at verse 7, Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He's a beloved brother and a faithful minister and a fellow servant of the Lord. I've sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. Now, in Paul's day, as in our day, one of the things that a written letter doesn't do well is it doesn't convey the tone. A couple times I've been caught. I sent somebody a letter or an email that I meant to be a funny email, tongue-in-cheek, and they didn't realize I was kidding and trying to be funny. And they got kind of upset at me, and I got a nasty letter back, and then I realized, oops, should have told you that I was joking. One of the editors to the assistant editors to the New York Times magazine at one point was starting to email when email was just starting, and his kids were teaching him how to email. And when his kids were emailing him, sometimes at the end of his email, at their email to their dad, they would write LOL. And he didn't know what this was. And he asked his kids, he said, every time you send me an email and a text, he says, you send it and it says LOL. What does that mean? And he said, his son sort of winked at him and says, well, Dad, it means lots of love. And he thought, wow, this is really cool. And David Gopnik, a couple days later, he has a friend at the New Yorker whose mother died. And so he sent him an email and he says, Bob, I'm thinking about you. You know, your mother died. You know, I hope you're okay. And he ends his email, LOL, lots of love. His friend got upset at him, and then he realized that LOL actually stands for laughing out loud, not lots of love. And he got so. But we don't do the tone when we write a letter. And Paul couldn't do that. And he realizes that in his letter, he said some heavy things. And among them, he's made a passing comment about the fact that they're in prison. He's writing to these friends far away, and he's told them that he's in prison. He goes, wait a minute, if they just read this line and they hear that we're in prison, they're going to be panicked. And so Paul says when Tychicus gets there, he's going to fill you in. So when Tychicus brings the letter to the Colossians, says, okay, by the way, just so you know, Paul's in prison, but he's okay, like pray for him, but don't panic. So Paul is saying when Tychicus comes, he's going to bring you my letter, and he's going to fill us in. He's going to tell you about how we're doing. He's going to fill in the details. Papyrus was expensive. You didn't write a 40-page letter. You wrote a smaller letter, and you had the details filled in by the guy who carried it. Now there's someone else who's been helped very directly by Paul's imprisonment. Paul wants them to know we're in prison, but it's okay. There's a reason we're in prison. God is using our imprisonment. And one of those people is a man called Onesimus. The Lord put this weird thing together. Paul ends up in prison, and in prison he meets a man called Onesimus. And Onesimus is a runaway slave. We don't know why he was in prison, but they start talking, and Paul realizes that Onesimus has run away from his responsibilities in Colossae, and he stole stuff from the man that he was working for. And here he is, caught in jail, and he winds up next to the Apostle Paul. Maybe they're in the same cell. They start talking, and as they share their story, Paul makes a discovery that the man from whom Onesimus has run away, Philemon, is a friend of his. And so God put that together. And there in prison, Paul led Onesimus to the Lord, to faith in Christ. And so Paul says, there's a reason for my imprisonment. And so when Paul sends Tychicus with this letter, he sends Onesimus too. Look at verse 8. I've sent him to you for this very purpose, Tychicus, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your cause. And with him, Onesimus. Now, as Onesimus goes back to Colossae, he's going back to the man that he's stolen from, that he has wronged, who is now his brother in Christ, and it's going to be important for Paul to provide an introduction for Onesimus. And listen to what Paul says about Onesimus, and with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. When he ran away, when he stole the kitty with the petty cash or whatever he stole when he left. He wasn't, but now he's one of you. They will tell you of everything that has taken place here. It was important for Paul to vouch for Tychicus so the letter would be well received, but he knew it was even more important for him to vouch for Onesimus. And so these two men will arrive. They will have made a stop in Ephesus to deliver the letter to the Laodiceans, and they'll travel another 120 miles or so along the Lycus River to Colossae, and there they're going to meet the church, and they're going to meet Philemon. And what's really striking is Paul's pastoral heart just keeps coming through. We go into the second part of the greeting, verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom we've received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him, and Jesus, who's called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Now, most of the Colossian believers were Gentiles. But Paul said there's these Jewish Christians here, and they're concerned about you, and they're working for you, and they're here with me, and you're Gentiles, and they're Jewish, and I know that Gentiles and Jewish have a hard time together, but you got to know, these good Jewish men, they're here, and they're working for you. And among them, there's even this one, his name is Aristarchus, and he is so committed to the cause that just like Paul, he'd accepted to be imprisoned. He's a fellow prisoner. He's in chains with me. And then comes this weird comment. I don't know if Mark rings a bell. Paul says something positive about Mark. Now, if you don't know the story, at one point, Paul and Barnabas are in ministry together. They're just starting as missionaries. They're just about to start their first missionary journey. And Barnabas has a young cousin called Mark. And Barnabas says to Paul, well, I know this young guy, and he's a good man, and he's going to come with us on this missionary trip, and he's hardworking, and he's going to... And so Mark joins them. They get a couple weeks into the trip, and Mark bails out. It's getting too hard. And so he chickens out and he runs home. Paul's pretty upset. Paul is so upset, in fact, that when they're about to begin the next journey together, they're about to start the second missionary trip, Barnabas says to Paul, you know what? Let's bring Mark along. Paul says, no way. He bailed out on us once. Gave up. Chickened out. Ran away. There's no way I'm giving him a second chance. And they had this sharp disagreement. And Paul and Barnabas separated. And you think, this is horrible. You know, Paul and Barnabas, they're these great missionaries. They did all this great stuff together, and now they're going to separate. What's God going to do? So you know what God does? Now he has two missionary teams instead of one. And now they can do twice as much work. God wanted them to separate. God had a whole bunch of areas that he wanted covered, and they couldn't do it because Paul and Barnabas were together, and he wanted them to and this is how God does it. And so Barnabas takes John Mark with him, and Paul continues with somebody else. And as God often does in his sovereignty, he can use even divisions and disagreement to accomplish his work. But now here we are, we're several years later, and this is Paul, and he's endorsing Mark. And he says, when Mark comes to you, receive him. And you go, wait, Paul, this is the guy you didn't like. This is the guy who said, don't give him a second chance. I got to tell you, of all of Paul's epistles, I don't think there's a single time where he knew what he wanted, he was very decisive. I don't think there's a single time where, humanly speaking, Paul says, you know, maybe I was a little rash in my judgment. Maybe I made a mistake. This is as close as Paul ever comes to saying, oops, I should have given him a second chance and I didn't. And there's a softness to Paul pastorally. He sends Mark and he says, you know what? He's a good guy. Receive him. This is Paul giving Mark a second chance. And maybe serving in prison mellowed him out. I don't know. Maybe that's what it takes. A couple of months in prison would soften anybody up, I guess, a little bit. I remember when we were working with the Bible Society, we were working with several groups that were bringing the Bible for the first time in areas in the northern Ukraine and Siberia, in areas of the world that had been deprived of the Bible for a long time. And as the Soviet Union was opening up again, we were able to get Bibles in there. We started getting testimonies of the way things had happened when these pastors were incarcerated in Siberia. And these stories started coming out of these little prisoner groups that were being sent along the railroad track in Siberia to build schools and hospitals. And it turns out that a lot of pastors were carpenters and plumbers and masons by trade. And so it turns out that this little group of 30 or 40 conscripted workers, out of the 40 or 50 in the group, there's like 20 who were pastors who were imprisoned for their faith. And they would drop them off in a little town and they would give them lumber, and they had to build a little school, they had to build a little nursing facility, a little hospital, and a little city hall, and then they'd move them on to the next town. And while they were there, they started planting churches. And when they were telling the story to a group of our supporters from the Bible Society, one of the ladies, and I don't know if she was Pentecostal or Baptist or Presbyterian, and she said, in the group, she says, they're all pastors. Were they all Baptists? Like, were they all Pentecostal ministers? Were they all Presbyterian? Like, how did they get along? Is it because they were the same denomination? And I'll never forget, one of the pastors said, he said, when you're in northern Siberia, working behind the Iron Curtain, working secretly behind the Soviets, your denomination didn't matter. We really didn't care. And so maybe it's a couple months in prison has sort of softened Paul. And yeah, John Mark had a problem, but you know what? Sitting in prison looking for help, John Mark sounded pretty good now. Send John Mark and receive him. We'll take John Mark. Send him along. They've been a comfort to me, says Paul. But there weren't just Jewish Christians. there's also some Gentiles. In verse 12, Epaphras, who is one of you. Now, when he says one of you, we don't know if that means he was a Gentile or he was a Colossian, but if he was a Colossian, he was a Gentile. So in contrast to those good Jewish men that they're working with them, there were also some Gentiles who had come to faith. Epaphras is one of you, a servant of Jesus Christ. He greets you. Listen to what he says. Always struggling on your behalf in his prayers. We talked last week about prayer and about how seriously you take your prayers. I got to tell you, I try hard to have a good prayer life, but I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that I'm struggling on anybody's behalf in my prayers. I wonder the last time you prayed for somebody this hard that you could say, I'm struggling on your behalf in my prayers. And here's what he's praying, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. Now, Paul and Aristarchus are in prison. They're limited what they can do. But Epaphras, he's free, and he's been coming and going. And we think he didn't just pray, we think he actually went there and worked there in that area. And there's a whole team there with Paul, including two men that we'll hear from again in the New Testament. In verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, the man who wrote the Gospel of Luke that we're reading about on Sunday morning. Luke and Demas. Unfortunately, Demas doesn't end well. As Paul neared the ends of his life in 2 Timothy 4, Paul's swan song, the last letter that he writes, he says this, he says, Demas is in love with the present world. He's deserted me, and he's gone home to Thessalonica. He went home, like John Mark earlier, except that John Mark stuck it out and he came back. And then Luke, just a quick footnote here. This is one of the key passages that leads us to think that Luke was a Gentile and not a Jewish believer. And the reason we think that is that early on in the list, Paul lists 3 or 4 men, and he says, these are the only Jewish Christians. These are the only men of the circumcision who are helping us. Those were the Jewish Christians. And he says, and then there's these others who are not part of the circumcision, who are not Jewish Christians, who are Gentile Christians. And then he lists them. He lists Epaphras, he lists Demas, and he lists Luke. This is one of the reasons why we think that Luke was a Gentile, which is something very interesting. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts. That is almost a quarter of the New Testament. A quarter of the New Testament, including Luke, the longest book of the New Testament, we believe, was written by a Gentile. Debate is still unresolved, still goes on. But the thing that strikes me is that Paul has this whole team around him. There's a couple Jewish believers. There's a guy who was in prison with them. There's a doctor. There's a guy who's a secretary who's writing out stuff by hand. If you read just the contents of Paul's epistles, it sounds like he's this one solitary guy doing all this, but he's not. There's this whole team around him. There's these detailed guys that are writing stuff down. There's guys that are brash and bold that are imprisoned with Paul. There's a runaway slave. There's a doctor. There's this whole strange group. And Paul shares the credit for the work being done with every one of them. But there's something that sets Paul apart. There's something that sets Paul apart. Well, Paul shares the credit for his work. There's something that Paul does that none of the others do. And there's kind of a sharp contrast. On the one hand, Paul is imprisoned. He's in chains, suffering an imprisonment. In one way, he's got no control. And yet, he's giving instructions. And he's given very authoritative instructions. And he writes letters with commands and instructions, and he says, after you've read my letter, pass it on to the people in Ephesus, and read the letter that I'm writing to Ephesus. Verse 15, give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea, to Nympha and the church in her house, and when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of Laodicea, and see that you also read the letter for Laodicea. And say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you've received from the Lord. Paul has this authority that none of the others have. Very early on, as the New Testament comes together, even before the New Testament was complete, there was a sense among the early church that the writings of the apostles and the writings of Paul were different. There was something unique about them. There was something authoritative about them. When Timothy wrote you a letter, that was kind of cool. When Titus wrote you a letter, that was kind of nice. When Aristarchus sent you a letter from prison, that was good. It was nice to get news from her. But when Paul wrote a letter, there was something different going on here. Something unique. Fairly early on, the early church realized that the writings of these men were on a separate level than just regular letters. And very early on, this collection of letters with the four Gospels became authoritative. And now Paul closes off. And there's this bittersweet verse with which he ends. Paul had problems with his eyes, problems with his health. We think that Paul caught malaria. We think we know where he got it. When he went up into Asia Minor, there was only one way to get up there. There was this narrow mountain path that went through the Taurus Mountains to get up there. I mean, aside from going thousands of kilometers that nobody did. And nobody liked to go through that path. It was marshy, it was swampy in areas, and you went through there, you were virtually guaranteed to come down with malaria. The Romans lost a bunch of troops in there going through that mountain path. And it's after Paul made that trip that he starts complaining of things. And the side effects of the malaria would have included migraine headaches, hard time sleeping, hard time with the digestive system, blurry eyesight, and weakening vision, and a bunch of other side effects. And so Paul's dictating this letter like he did many of the others. So there's a scribe. There's a guy sitting next to Paul, and Paul dictates the letter. And as he gets to the end of the letter, he says, hand me the pen. In verse 18, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. In one of the other letters, he says, look at the big letters now because I got to write this big because my eyesight's shot. It's a weird thing to say. Remember my chains. In the fields near the village of Gettysburg, at the beginning of July 1863, the Union and the Confederate forces pummeled each other for 3 long days, until the Union prevailed and slowly began to tilt the odds of the American Civil War. It is the battlefield where there was the greatest number of casualty on both sides. Many of the dead were eventually moved and interred at Arlington National Cemetery. But 4.5 months after this battle, the battle was dedicated as a memorial cemetery for the fallen of the Civil War. And President Lincoln was there, and he gave what were meant to be passing remarks at the end of the day. There were actually 2 other speeches given early in the day. One of the generals actually spoke for over 2.5 hours, and the crowd listened in. For 2.5 hours, he explained the details of the battle and how it had gone and the strategy behind. And after all the speeches and all the music, as the day was coming to an end, they asked Abraham Lincoln to say a few words. In his now famous Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent, this is when he gave it. 200 words and change. One of his shortest speeches. But there's a funny little thing that happens in it. In that speech, Lincoln says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And the funny thing is that everybody remembers the Gettysburg Address, but nobody remembers the battle. And so in the irony, Abraham Lincoln, with this little short speech at the end of the day, and he says, okay, nobody's going to remember what we say here at this point, but here's a few words. And everybody remembers what he said, and it's a speech that all the high school students in the States learned by heart, and I even have to learn it in Canadian literature. And it was, Paul ends his sign-off with this. He says, remember my chains. And one of the commentators made this interesting thought. Within 100 years of Paul writing this, the chains that had held Paul had rusted away to dust. But the work that he had done carried on. 2,000 years later, the fact that Paul was in prison, was in chain, was in this, it doesn't really matter anymore. But the work that he did has carried on 2,000 years later. We get in hard circumstances, you and I, and all we can see is the prison walls, and all we can see is the chains, and we get really frustrated by the immediate circumstances that limit us. And those circumstances are completely inconsequential to God because God is doing something so much more significant, something so much more important. You know, we think we've found the remnants of one of the prisons in which Paul may have spent a couple of days. We're not sure. Most of the other prisons where he was held are long ago disappeared. A couple of people think they know the spot roughly where Paul may have been beheaded along the Appian Way, the big highway living out, but we're not sure we've got the spot. And certainly any of the metal that held the chains that imprisoned Paul is long gone. But 2,000 years later, the work that he did is still here. When we work for the church, when we work for the Lord, when we follow faithfully in the things that he calls us to do, our chains and our limitations are so present for us. Sometimes they're all-consuming. And often God is doing something much more significant that will be there, that will still have an impact long after the chains are gone. There's this neat verse I like in Hebrews 6:10, but I have it memorized in the King James. It says, God is not unrighteous so as to forget your work and the love you've shown for his name in serving the saints as you still do. God remembers. He doesn't just remember your chains, he remembers your work. God is not unrighteous. It would be unfair of God to forget your work. But God remembers your work in the love you've shown for his name in caring for the saints as you still do. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for this list of names at the end of the book of Colossians. Spur us on by Paul's example. We don't want to be like Demas, who loved the world. Father, give us the courage that Mark had, that after he had given up once, that he returned to the task again and again. Father, like Archippus, that we might fulfill the ministry that we received from you. Thank you for the example of these men and women. In the name of Christ our Lord, and for the sake of his church. Amen.